For 3 days as the wind howled, the battle raged. And for 3 days the advantage swung back and forth between the Scots and the Vikings. The sorcery-strengthened hailstorm blew around the battle-eager men on the troop-inhabited surskies of the raging sea, driving the very vigorous crew with war shields towards the shores of Scotland. When you think of Largs or come to visit, there is no doubt that the Thistle monument is one of the most recognised landmarks. Built in 1912 to commemorate the Battle of Largs in 1263, it stands 70 feet high and is made of whinstone. And I think it speaks for itself as to why it's called the Thistle.
So Leslie, to set the scene for us, could you tell us just a little bit about what Scotland would have looked like during this time period?
So if we could time travel back to the middle of the 13th century from this location and look out over the Clyde estuary, there would be very little difference in geological terms. The landscape would have looked very similar. However, the political landscape would have looked very different. Here on the mainland, we would be standing on Scottish territory, but only 3 miles away across the water in Great Cumbria, you would be standing on Norse territory. For over the course of 500 years, from the first raids on the holy Isle of Iona, the Vikings captured and held on to all the Scottish islands from Orkney and Shetland right down the west coast, engulfing the Hebrides, Western Isles, Arran and the Cumbria Islands right down to the Isle of Man and beyond.
Would it be safe to say that Scotland was almost unrecognisable from how it is today?
The people of Scotland were living in fear of Norse invasion, especially those who lived on the west coast. It was a very dangerous place to stay. So imagine knowing that just over there was Norse territory and the Vikings could attack at any time. Would you live here? So even towns and villages that were much further inland weren't safe. If you lived near a body of water that was accessible via rivers, estuaries and lochs, you were also in danger. The Vikings were very determined. They would stop at nothing, even dragging their ships miles across land in order to access inland lochs, such as Loch Lomond, which was subject to a violent attack in 1263. Even strongholds, such as Dumbarton Castle, was laid siege in 870, held for 4 months until they had to surrender after running out of water. However, alliances were being born from this fear and a new nation was formed. It was called Alba. And if you can trace the origins of this modern Scotland anywhere, it was to this new fugitive kingdom. A kingdom united in opposition to and in fear of the Vikings.
Before the events here at Largs, how long had the Vikings had their eyes on Scotland?
At the end of the 8th century, Norway was in crisis. There was no king, only local chieftains who were increasingly fighting over land and power. The population was expanding and poor land made it difficult to farm. Swedish Vikings were already raiding, trading and exploiting routes to the east. However, the Norwegian Vikings had their eye on the west. The first recorded attack in Scotland was in the year 795 on the holy Isle of Iona. It was well known that the Abbey of St Columba contained the treasure of Christians hoping to buy themselves a place in heaven. Needless to say, Iona was raided another 4 times over the next 25 years eventually being burnt to the ground in 825. But they did not stop with abbeys and monasteries. Very soon they started to colonise the islands, using Orkney and Shetland as a strategic base to launch further attacks down the west coast. Eventually the Scots fought back under King Alexander II. They began to regain control over some areas. In the year 1262, his son Alexander III attacked the occupying enemy with brutal force and regained the Western Isles from Norwegian control. News of these defeats was brought to the Norwegian King Haakon IV. Determined to take revenge on the Scots, he led a mighty fleet of longboats over to Scotland, first to Orkney. Joined there by local forces, he sailed down through the Hebrides, gathering more and more Norse vessels on the way. When he eventually reached the Clyde estuary, his fleet consisted of 160 longships, manned by an estimated 15,000 Vikings. He was determined to reoccupy his lost Scottish territories and to reassert his power and strength. King Haakon moored his fleet at Arran and met with King Alexander's envoys to discuss a peace treaty. When talks fell apart, King Haakon lost patience and sent 60 of his ships up Loch Long to Arica, dragging them 1.5 miles across land to Tarbet at Loch Lomond, and plundered the towns and villages of the loch, eventually coming out at Dumbarton Castle via the River Leven and attacked the castle. Meanwhile, the rest of King Haakon's ships at Arran were readying for an attack on the mainland, somewhere along the west coast. King Alexander thought it would take place in Ayr, and so that is where he and the bulk of his army was based. However, he took the precaution of placing his troops at strategic intervals all along the coast, even as far north as Largs. However, the choice of where King Haakon wanted to attack was taken out of his hands when, at the beginning of October 1263, a mighty storm blew in, forcing him to try and take shelter beside the Cumbria Islands. Half his fleet was separated by fierce winds and ended up shipwrecked on the coast of Largs, and some even as far down as Ardrossan and Sea Mill. For 3 days the wind howled and the battle raged as more of King Alexander's troops came to the Scots' aid. Although King Alexander himself was not present, it seems he remained in Ayr. However, King Haakon himself was there. One of the ships that was blown towards Largs was the King's very own, a huge vessel that carried at least 60 men, who came ashore to take part in the battle. King Haakon himself wanted to land, but was urged to stay on board and relay commands.
Looking at the numbers, how did the size of the armies compare between the Scots and the Vikings?
There are many accounts of the numbers of Norse and Scots at the Battle of Largs. One such claim by Hector Boes in 1526 tells of 24,000 casualties on the Norwegian side and those of the Scots at 5,000, including knights on horseback. But his account was found to be completely over-exaggerated. However, there is no certainty on the matter, but the Scots may have numbered around 1,500 maximum and around 800 to 900 Norse, including 60 from King Haakon's own ship. Most of the army were made up of local countrymen from the surrounding area, like a militia that were probably not used to warfare on this scale. It's hard to know what these men would have been thinking. I've often wondered myself how I would feel to see a huge fleet of Viking longships coming towards the coast. Between that and the horrendous wind and weather conditions, it would have been an awe-inspiring sight indeed. To stand your ground and fight against these adversaries must have taken some courage indeed.
What were some of the lasting effects of the Battle of Largs?
So with the Peace Treaty of Perth in 1266, the Norwegians agreed to give up all claims to the Western Isles in return for 4,000 marks. In 1281, King Haakon's grandson Eric, on succeeding to the throne of Norway, married Margaret, the daughter of the Scottish King Alexander III. Another royal marriage in 1469 between Scots King James III and Margaret of Denmark ended Scandinavian claims over Orkney and Shetlands. However, the Vikings did not leave after that. Rather, they integrated themselves into the new culture and religion of Scotland.
Did the Vikings' presence here leave anything behind that still resonates in Scotland today?
Well, according to legend, it was a thistle that turned the tide of battle in favour of the Scots. It was reported that the Norsemen came upon a group of Scottish warriors. Planning to attack them under the cover of darkness, the Vikings took off their footwear to creep up on the unsuspecting Scots. However, the ground was covered in thistles, and as they crept towards their prey, one of the advancing Vikings stood on one. He screamed out in pain. Instantly alerted to their presence, the Scots escaped the ambush and defeated the invaders. So although there's no historic evidence that this happened, it's a good tale. In 1470, the thistle was adopted by King James III as the national emblem of Scotland, 1 year after the Norwegians abandoned their claim to Orkney and Shetland. Still to this day, it continues to stand proud as Scotland's emblem. Today, the battle is still commemorated with an annual Viking Festival held in Largs. It runs from the last weekend of August to the first weekend in September. Along with a market, entertainment, air displays and parades, it hosts a Viking village which members of the public can experience what life was like in 13th century Norway. Scotland and Norway have had something of a rocky past. However, it has only helped in making our bonds stronger. The Vikings changed the landscape and history of Scotland, and our heritage and culture will always be entwined.